Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrea Lopez Herrera, and I am an investigator with the Prince George County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and education enforcement agency. The Office of Human Rights investigates complaints of discrimination, combats human trafficking, ensures equitable access to all county government services in the language of the person's preference, and educates on human rights and social justice. With me today as co-host is Renee Battle Brooks, the Executive Director of the Office of Human Rights. It is our pleasure to welcome you all this evening to another one of our events, Does Your Zip Code Impact Your Whole Life? Series with the Prince George County Memorial Library System. This series examines issues of social equity and justice and how where we live impacts our life, our education, our access to housing and lending, and in fact, our whole lives. Tonight, our focus is redlining and environmental justice with special guest, Professor Carlton Waterhouse. Professor Carlton Waterhouse is an international expert on environmental law and environmental justice, as well as reparations and redress of historic injustices. He, he recently testified on the importance of reparations for from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the Organization of American States. He's a Fulbright Research Scholar and is a board member of the Environmental Law Institute. Professor Waterhouse is a graduate of Pennsylvania State University, where he studied engineering and the ethics of technology before deciding to study law. He's a graduate of Howard University School of Law. While in law school, he served as an intern with the Lawyers Committee of Civil Rights under Law and the United States Environmental Protection Agency. After completing law school, Professor career as an attorney with the EPA, where he served in the Office of Regional Counsel in Atlanta, Georgia, and the Office of General Counsel in Washington, D.C. At the EPA, he served as chief counsel for the agency in several significant cases and as a national and regional expert on environmental justice, earning 3 of the agency's prestigious national awards. Professor Waterhouse graduated with honors from the Chandler School of Theology at Emory University with a Master's of Theological Studies degree and the Emory University Graduate School with a PhD in Social Ethics. Thank you for being with us tonight, Professor Waterhouse. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you both. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you very much, Renee. It's good to see both of you.
Thank
Nice
you.
to meet you.
So, Andrea?
So we can go right in with the presentation if you like, Mr. Waterhouse, or...
Okay, so I will. Well, good evening to everyone, and for our friends on the West Coast, good afternoon. We're talking today about the issue of redlining and environmental justice. And for those of you who are not familiar with either issue, I just want to give a little bit of background to help folks have some context. So as most of you know, redlining was a practice that was pretty much the norm in the United States, dating back to as early as the early 1930s and continuing up into the early 1970s in a legal manner. In other words, it was lawful to do so, and in some ways even encouraged to do so. And I'll say what redlining was in just a moment. Redlining in that time was the practice by the United States government through the Fair Housing Administration to discourage banks from lending money to people who lived in certain areas. The whole idea of does your zip code determine your whole life? Based on where you live, there was a determination that you were not worthy of receiving a loan. As a result of this federal agency's determinations, banks who were giving loans to people in those areas were considered as making risky loans and were not able to get the benefit of the federal insurance programs that otherwise were being made available. As a result, banks chose to give loans in areas where the federal government was willing to support them if things went south. And they chose not to give loans in spaces that were the opposite. And so to help the states, to help the lenders to know where they were likely to say it was a good loan or a bad loan, the administration, actually, this agency went forward and developed maps of the entire country. And in developing those maps, they actually gave descriptions and color coding to show what neighborhoods would be neighborhoods that were good for giving loans and what neighborhoods would be bad for giving loans. And one of the principal criteria of determining what a good neighborhood was for giving a loan was the presence of African Americans and other unwanted groups. And so we're fortunate today that there's an organization at the University of Richmond, a group of people who've developed a project called Mapping Inequality. And in the Mapping Inequality project, they've gone and found all of these maps and put them together online so that anyone is able to go online who has internet access and to access these maps and put in the name of a major metropolitan area to see exactly what these maps looked like and to learn how these maps might have influenced the decisions that were made at the time by not only banks, but businesses and everybody else. Because once a bank decides not to lend money to residents who live in those areas, there are a host of cascading consequences that result from that. If banks are giving money to people to build or buy private homes, then that means they're more likely that commercial industries and desirable businesses will move into those neighborhoods because they have residents there who they see as worthy of doing business with them or who they can count on to do business with them. And so there are a host of other kinds of land uses that move into areas where they are not able to find homeowners. And some of this bias in the way people decide where to locate their businesses became a long-standing set of practices that resulted in some communities being disinvested in, is what we would say today, and other communities having high level of investment. And of course, those communities that got a high level of investment continue to attract additional desirable land uses, while other communities attracted unwanted land uses that were associated with greater risk of harm to people. So certain kinds of dangerous industries would operate there, or land uses that were associated with, not dangerous, but undesirable neighbors. So for example, landfills moving in, or industries that maybe weren't risky or dangerous, but smelled, odors that are associated with those industries and practices, or industries that had a lot of truck traffic that was constantly coming back and forth through the neighborhoods. And so this practice of developing redlining had influenced not only in where people could particularly get loans to live, impacting their own ability to build a financial future for them and their families, but also locking some people into renting exclusively because you couldn't get a loan being an African American in a neighborhood that was predominantly African American. And it also locked people into what were known as land contracts. And some of you may remember Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an article a few years ago about reparations that looked specifically at this idea of land contracts. That would be a contract where a person said, oh, I'm going to buy this house on contract. There wasn't a mortgage. There wasn't a bank that had given them a loan, but the owner of the house had said, if you make certain payments to me over a certain time period, then you will be able to ultimately take the house at the end of that time period. Well, using land contracts, one of the negative things that Ta-Nehisi Coates talked about in his article, in case of reparations, was that those who engaged in those land contracts in some places could make investments all the way up to the next to the last payment. But if they defaulted, then the landowner could say, well, you defaulted on the contract, and even though you made all but one of the payments, I'm no longer obligated to go ahead and sell you this house. And as a result, you can move out, and that's the end of our agreement. So as a result, that person who was selling the house under the land contract ultimately would receive all of the payments, which would be in excess of the value of the rent that was being covered, but they would get all of the benefit of those payments and still end up keeping their house. This robbed a lot of African Americans of the wealth that they otherwise would have gotten if they had gotten a mortgage, made payments. And of course, if you miss a mortgage payment, one payment would not be enough to cancel your mortgage, right? There's opportunities built in the law that says that you have an opportunity to redeem that house, to catch up on back payments, to find another loan. There are a host of things built into the law to protect persons who are buying homes, and the requirement to go through a formal foreclosure procedure before your house can be taken, a burden of proof that the bank has to present, a host of protections for homeowners. And in that case, normally for whites at that time, who were able to get loans. But for African Americans who could only buy homes through land contracts, or others who were limited to land contract purchases, they were locked out of those systems, and they were really vulnerable and targets for some unscrupulous, sometimes landowners, who really were seeking to take advantage of them to get extra money, but really without any intention of ever selling them their homes. And so this practice of redlining ended formally in the 1970s when it became unlawful to use that as a criteria to decide whether a person would get a loan. But it didn't end the practice of redlining, because people continued to decide what the interest rates would be for home loans that they distributed based on what neighborhoods people lived in, and also to decide whether or not they would offer loans in some cases. This then became not a formalized practice required by the federal government to provide benefits to banks, but it became a practice of banks themselves and mortgage companies who decided, oh, it's too risky to lend people in this zip code, or too risky to lend money to people in this neighborhood, or we're going to charge them a 3% higher interest rate because they live in this zip code or because they live in this neighborhood. And so that continued practice of redlining has continued since the 1970s and still continues today. It is unlawful, but it is still going on. And we have cases that happen where banks are shown, or mortgage companies have been shown to discriminate based on neighborhoods and based on the concentration of African Americans and other racial groups in neighborhoods, which is the exact thing which was going on in the Mapping Inequality Project, by explaining how this practice dates back to the federal government's behavior going to the 1930s. So for that reason, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'm going to show you all the Mapping Inequality Project website. And I'm going to show you in this version so that any of you all would be able to go to the website yourself. All you have to do is go into your favorite search engine and type in Mapping Inequality. And if you don't get the University of Richmond website, which is shown in the URL here on the screen, put in Mapping Inequality, University of Richmond, and I'm sure you'll end up getting to this site. And so if you're at this site, then once you come here, you can see the background description of what redlining was and how redlining took place. And then over in the left-hand column, you can read more information about the history of redlining. You can get resources if you're a teacher and you want to teach about redlining. And then you also have the ability to do what I'm about to do, which is explore the maps. Now, by exploring the maps, you can see on this map that there were certain places where a lot of these maps were being developed for these communities. And so in these cities, you can see there's significant levels of mapping that took place to describe and to provide limitations on who should be the beneficiaries of loans. And in light of those kind of limitations that were put in place, you would ultimately see that this was a very common practice in certain parts of the U.S. Especially for the East Coast over to the Midwest, and then on the West Coast. And in so doing, we're going to just get an example because we want to talk about what this looks like in the environmental context. And since we are talking to an audience that's based in Maryland, we're going to look at one of those maps, and that's going to be for Baltimore. Andrea, Renee, can you all see this?
Yes.
Great.
Perfect.
And so what you're seeing here is a map of Baltimore, Maryland, that reflects, in fact, the process that I was explaining to you earlier that was carried out by the administration. And so this map basically has a key on the bottom, or legend on the bottom of it, on the bottom left-hand corner, and you'll see that this color code is present to describe what were desirable properties for loan purposes. So you can see the green represented the desirable properties for loan. The blue represented second grade, not the best loan, but still acceptable. The yellow represented caution, and that really discouraged giving loans in these areas. And then the red, which is where we get the term redlining, represented those areas, red meaning stop, that loans should not be given out. Now, if you look here on the left-hand side, you can see, how this description related to these color categories, and you can follow the color categories and touch it, and it will highlight those colors for you, which is a really neat factor. So that being said, there are descriptions which I think are worth us having a moment to review. So you can look at description of yellow. This is C6 here, and it says no immediate danger of Negro encroachment, but there's a heavy concentration of Negroes in the section adjoining. Section is somewhat spotty and has few ground rent up to $120. So you can see that this note explains the reasoning of the folks in the administration for making that determination that this should be yellow. And then formally, when you look at the redlined area in D4, you can read the description: Negro concentration and excessive ground rents in many cases. And so we're working then with this basic concept that our history in the United States of where people lived was very much grounded in not just where people wanted to live, but grounded in where people could get money from banks to live. And the idea of the banking system was a huge development, because prior to the development of the this administration and this banking protocol, many Americans could not afford the price of buying a home, because there was somewhat of a housing shortage for GIs who were coming back from the different wars. There was a need for GI housing and a general desire for better housing. So to accomplish that, one of the things the government did was to change the rates that were available to people who got these loans. The new rates meant you only had to put a small percentage down, maybe 10, 15, max 20% down, and then you could make payments over a 30-year term. That is our standard mortgage today. However, before this happened, that was not the standard mortgage. People would have to pay off their mortgages in a much shorter time period, like 10 years, and often would have to have a down payment as high as 50% in some cases. So the development of this new loan system made housing broadly available for Americans across the country, in many ways bolstered the creation of the middle class. And African Americans, as we can see, and other groups were then locked out of the ability to take advantage of this new system of building wealth through the acquisition of housing. And so as a result, their experiences over the following 60 years was drastically different than their white counterparts. Okay, that being said, you can see this map. We want to talk about environmental justice now. Now, environmental justice primarily is for, the best way to understand it would be to understand that environmental justice is the mechanism by which people find themselves disproportionately exposed to pollution, either air pollution or water pollution or pollution in indoor pollution based on, for example, lead in their homes. It may be disproportionate exposure to climate risk. It could be exposure based on heat island effect, where certain parts of the city will be higher than others because they lack tree cover. And the consequence of that, it can be temperatures as high as 10 degrees higher in one part of the city than the other. And so you'd understand if you're living in a place where it's 105 degrees in one part of the city and 115 in another, there are going to be a lot more adverse health effects where the temperature is higher. Additionally, people who are subject to wildfires or flooding risk or hurricanes, all of these are climate-based inequalities that can be present. Based on where you live, you have a different level of risk than people who live in other places in your exact same city. And so that's a critical thing to understand. How then did those discriminatory practices of the past influence where people live today? And that's the important piece for us to keep in mind. Even though those discriminatory practices ended, for example, formally in the 70s, they continue informally today, not as commonly as they would have in the 80s or the 90s, but still present. We have cases dating to the Great Recession where a major bank was found to be liable for engaging in redlining related practices. And so today, where people live is still influenced by where people have lived. So I'm going to share my screen again, and this time I'm going to show you a different map. This time I'm going to show you a map called EJ Screen. And EJ Screen is a map that it's a screening tool that's developed and maintained by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And it provides information on environmental risks that are faced by people living in different communities. So you can see here a map of Baltimore, and you might recall previously that I had shown you from the mapping inequality map, a map. Can you all see that I switched maps here?
Yes.
Yeah.
You can see a map of Baltimore, and you can see these redlined areas, right? And you can see these yellow areas. Now, if we go to the EJ screen, this is also a map of Baltimore, but it doesn't show you any of those areas. You might note Druid Hill Park here on the left to help you get your bearings. And if we go up, this is Druid Hill Park here on the top left. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
So you'll see this kind of helps you orient where you are on the map of Baltimore for redlining purposes and where you are on the map Baltimore for environmental purposes. So if we take this area and we decide we want to look at certain pollution, well, first, let's look at who lives there today. We saw who lived in these areas in the past. Let's look and see who lives in these areas today. So if you look here, the right side of the map shows you the legend or the key to understand what means what. So if you see a lightly gray shaded area, it means 50 to 60 percentile of the population there is made up of people of color. And if you see the red areas, you'll see 95 to 100% of the people in those areas are made up of people of color. And if you look at the dark yellow or brown or orange, depending on what your eyes tell you, or yellow brown, you'll see that that's 90 to 95% people of color. And so if I switch back to mapping inequality, you can see there's almost this butterfly kind of pattern that shows almost these wings that shows who lives where. This middle section is the industrial part of Baltimore. And so people don't tend to live there. So it's not residential. And then you see on the sides who lives on the outskirts there. And then we come back to EJ screen and you can see how that maps up. So today, these inner areas don't have as many people of color. They're down to 60 or 70%, probably some gentrification happening there. And then you have these other areas that have the higher percentage. Well, we can connect that with where certain pollution sources are in the community. So for example, There are facilities that are dangerous facilities that pose a risk to those who live nearby. They have what's known as a risk management program. And those facilities that operate pursuant to a risk management program are those that pose a risk of either some kind of massive air pollution that results from a leak or a fire or an explosion. And so if you look here on EJ screen and you go down to RMP facility proximity, for example, it kind of shows you where people are who are at risk for exposure, right? Just to kind of get bearings on how this map demonstrates levels of risk. Of course, the closer you are to the inner city, the greater you are at risk outside of a certain band of the closest proximity to being in the center of the city. But then if you switch from looking for RMP facility, you might look to see, oh, where is there exposure, for example, well, let me explain EJ Screen quickly, and then we'll look to take questions. EJ Screen is a site that's a database available online. All you have to do is type in EJ Screen in your favorite web browser. It will come up. It's maintained by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. It allows you to compare where people live relative to the United States population or relative to their state. So if you look, for example, at something like ozone, you can see here that relative to United States population, ozone levels are in the 80th to 90th percentile on this side of Baltimore, and in the 95th to 100th percentile on the right side of Baltimore. So that kind of gives you an understanding of how environment connects with where people live. Exposure to air ozone is particularly relevant and troublesome for people who have certain health disparities. So for example, we'll go down to health disparities and we'll talk about asthma. And you'll see here as we look at asthma, you'll see how that butterfly effect I talked about before that exists with the mapping inequality also shows you where asthma rates are compared to the country at the highest rate, 95 to 100%. And that just means that this is the level of asthma you see in the places with the highest level of asthma across the country, up to the 100th percentile, which is the various highest, to down to the 95th percentile, which shows you very high levels of asthma. And so I wanted to introduce you all to these tools to help you relate back to how zip code, not only where you live today, but maybe where people lived 70 years ago or 80 years ago is still affecting exactly where people are finding themselves exposed to pollution still today. And so there's a whole history that goes well beyond these particular examples in Baltimore and can relate to most of the country. But that provides for us at least a fundamental explanation of how we can see inequality and how we're still living in the legacy of past discriminatory practices that were lawful at the time and still are influencing what levels of exposure people still have to pollution today.
Wow. You've given us a lot of food for thought and lots of great tools. And for that, I'm very, very thankful. I have lots of questions, but when you were talking about sort of those who benefited from redlining and in the early days, and of course we know that, right, those that benefit still because of the legacy. So I was taking notes. So we know that during this time, banks benefited, the government benefited, commercial entities benefited, communities benefited. And then also when you talked about land contracts, so those individuals benefited. So all of those that benefit, I'd like to explore realistically what would reparations look like,
Mm.
right? And it's very controversial. Well, yeah, it's controversial in some communities. But, we are talking about almost 100 years, right? The 30s. This is 2024.
That's right.
And we know what just one generation who a family has sort of benefits and I don't know the word, but yes, a leg up, right? Privilege. There are many ways to say it, right? Just one generation. But if we're talking 100 years, we're talking about multiple. And so, there's definitely a movement in this country, and people who either say this is ridiculous, this doesn't exist, there was not, right? In the face of empirical evidence of what our government did, right? And the collateral. So can you just speak to sort of that broad issue and what would that look like?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. So, as mentioned in my bio, reparations and environmental justice are both aspects of the work that I do, the research, scholarship, and teaching. And from the reparations standpoint, I would want to say that, reparations are grounded in two things. One, they're grounded in the experience of the people who have suffered some historic injustice. And they're also grounded in the responsibility and accountability for governments who perpetuated that injustice, right? And so in the context of different nations around the world, we can think about how reparations have been provided in the past. Of course, Nazi Germany is a famous one. It's one of the earliest cases we have to look to, where the German government, the new German government that came in, provided reparations and continues to provide reparations to the state of Israel in annual payments, but also to individual Jewish Holocaust survivors. And so the call for reparations would be a call for the governments who were involved and responsible for this mistreatment and historic injustice to African Americans to provide them with some redress as a way of responding to this improper conduct of the past. And so there's two bases for reparations that I'll kind of get to. One is the dignity harm, right? The fact that these people were treated wrongly is an insult to their citizenship and an insult to their dignity. They deserved better, right? They deserved better than to have their government discriminate against them based on their race, right? Which is a factor outside of their control. And so that's a dignity harm that you would say, oh, that was wrong, that should be righted. And then there are the consequences of that harm. All dignity harms don't have the same level of consequences, right? So there can be insults and offenses, but the harms might not be so substantial. Here, we've talked about a lot of the harms that are associated with it. And even in this case, many vets, because of racial discrimination, racially discriminatory covenants, and discrimination in where you lived, a vet couldn't get, even though you had the GI Bill, you couldn't get the benefit of a loan if you lived in a neighborhood that was redlined, because the banks wouldn't give it to you. So you found that even though Black vets who would have had access in theory to some of those benefits weren't able to execute them. So there are harms, and then not only would the government correct the wrong, but remedy the harm. So correcting the wrong would be to say this was wrong for us to do. It would be to offer an apology. It would be to acknowledge that it had occurred and that people were entitled to something better from their government and that their government failed them. That's one way of correcting that dignity harm. But then you want to also remedy the consequences, right? So there's that remedy or making, a redress offer, even though it may not be enough. It's rarely enough. The funding, the payment, the programs are rarely enough to actually make up for what happened, but it's the best governments tend to be able to do, right? So your, race of people, your, group of people was almost exterminated by the government. You can't really fix that with money, right? But governments provide money as a way of showing the legitimacy of the recognition that this was wrong. So we would look for a Jim Crow-based reparation program or award that would then go to any of the people who were the victims of that wrong, right? And so we saw this happen in the United States. Actually, I think it was awarded under President Bush. It started under President Reagan, and it was reparations for Japanese internees. So there was a recognition that Japanese internees had been wrongfully taken from their homes. Many of them lost their property in the West Coast, and they were shipped off to live in concentration camps, in the Midwest. And so that was wrong, done in the 1940s. But then in the late 80s, the United States government acknowledged it. They passed the law to provide reparations to all of those remaining victims of that internment. Right. And so in the same way, you could have reparations that would be for any person who was a victim of that kind of discriminatory practice. And that's an example. Reparation scholars and activists tend, though, to focus on reparations that are grounded in slavery and what they call the continuing legacy. So they view these kind of practices that took place in the Jim Crow era as part of the continuing legacy of slavery. And so they argue that reparations should be provided to cover everything. I actually think that's a legitimate argument, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? I think that it's possible to say these victims of Jim Crow warrant their own particular form of redress that the federal government should be engaged in.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful in framing that for all of us, and perhaps for those that are sitting on the fence, or for those who absolutely don't believe. Yeah, thank you. I have lots of questions, but go ahead, Andrea.
So we actually have a question from a viewer that we'll have right up.
And can you read it, Andrea? Because not everybody can.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Sorry. So
No worries.
The question is, what are penalties for redlining today?
So in the most recent case, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was Wells Fargo who actually wasn't responsible for engaging in the redlining, but Countrywide, which was a former mortgage company that was active in the 90s, probably part of the 2000s up until the Great Recession. Countrywide was found guilty of engaging in redlining. And so there were penalties associated with it from the federal government as a result of this practice, but also civil liability. And so there was a requirement that the federal government forced them to pay an award to those who were found to have been victims of their redlining practices. And so Countrywide paid out to persons who were found and identified primarily in these cases for having higher interest rates because of their racial identity. They had to pay back to them some financial kind of damages that came out of the case that the United States government brought against the mortgage company.
Can I just jump in real quick? In one of the keys or legends, you talked about ground rent. Can you explain for those who may not understand what that is and sort of the relationship to what
you said ground rent?
Yes.
So in the Mapping and Equality website, there's just a note about how the persons are responsible for paying in association with the land that they're using, the rents that they're actually using. And so the map makers were using the amount of rent that was being charged as a basis to identify the desirability of the place for purposes of lending money. And so where they found that there was a practice of having excessively high ground rents relative to the quality of the property, it was identified as an undesirable place to be. Note, people are subjugated to having overly high ground rents that are inflated to be able to live in the place. And then insult to injury is that the federal government would use that as a basis to say you shouldn't lend money who live in those places. So that means those people, more than anybody, are locked out of having alternatives to having to pay those extortion, those very high rents. And of course, where you lived in the days of, limited transportation, and even today, if you don't have your own vehicle and you need to go back and forth to work, you may have limited options about what's a viable place to live. People can be taken advantage of as a result of that. And we saw that was exactly what happened historically as well.
So Professor Waterhouse, take us into your perfect world, right? And everybody has to do what Professor Waterhouse says to correct this, right? And we're all on board, and money is not an issue, and believability is not an issue. How do we stop this, correct it, and move forward?
So there's a lot to stop. And so part of the answer kind of depends on how broad you want this to be, right? So we talked about the fact that you were in a community was redlined influenced the institutions in that community. It influenced the schools and the resources for the school. It influenced what kind of businesses moved in there, which influenced the employment opportunities for the community members, which influenced the access to good quality food, access to healthcare, access to banking, financial institutions, access to people in your community who have education, right? And so all of these resources are the difference we see between communities today that find themselves suffering and communities that find themselves flourishing. Yeah. So the goal to me is flourishing. We want to see communities and their residents flourish. But what we see today is instead, some communities are flourishing more than ever before, and other communities are suffering. And so the research that I've done, and you can, if you're interested in my dissertation, you have a chance to kind of take a look at this argument as it's developed. It's called The Full Price of Freedom. If you put in my name and The Full Price of Freedom, you should be able to find it. It's available online. In my dissertation, I make an argument that if you want to see people who are doing well, look for institutions that are doing well and the people who live near them. Because flourishing institutions tend to be in communities that are flourishing. And the reason for that is that institutions provide to members of the society benefits, right? They provide benefits that will make the members of the society experience greater opportunities, greater awareness, greater health, greater knowledge, greater education, all as a result of the institution. Yeah. And so the consequence of this conduct is that institutional development in communities of color in particular has been stifled and interfered with. So the ability of those communities to be able to develop the kind of economic, commercial, political, educational institutions that can allow for the members of those communities to thrive has never been addressed. Right. And so for me, the fix partially is to see that resources are redirected into institutions that are focused on benefiting the members of their community, educational, political, economic institutions. And so I argue in my dissertation that reparations should be institutional based, that reparations should be provided to institutions that are committed to providing benefits to those who are the victims of discrimination and their descendants. And so this is a way to use the long view to address these historic problems by having institutional benefits that inure to not only me and my parents, my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, my great-great-grandchildren, my great-great-grandchildren. Right now we're in the world of what wealth creates. Wealth creates opportunities that goes down through generations. And institutional wealth does the same thing.
That's beautiful. What's an example for our audience of an institution, or maybe something a little practical everyone.
Yeah. So I think when I talk about an institution in an educational context, I would say, let's look at some place like, Howard University, or let's look at some place like Spelman College, or let's look at some place like Hampton University, right? These are institutions, they're educational institutions, and they're educational institutions which have been providing benefits to African Americans and others for over a century.
Yeah.
And if you look at those people who are both worked at those institutions and been graduates of those institutions have helped those families and those individuals as a result of their association with that institution.
Yeah, that's a very good practical example for us to, yeah.
And in the same way that exists in the educational context, you can think there are fewer, but you can think about Black funeral homes. In particular, right? They have long-standing kind of institutional presence in the community. You can think about Black banks. Today, there's so few, there aren't as many examples, but they've had more historic experience of providing benefits. You can look at commercial entities, and those that thrive also have benefits. You might want to look at Tyler Perry's work in Atlanta.
Yeah.
As an example. But you can look at churches even. You look at some of the, we're talking to PG County, so we can look at strong churches in PG County, like Ebenezer AME Church, which I come out of, right? And the benefits that it's been able to provide to the members and people in the community. Reed Temple, right? You can look at how, sorry for the bias towards AME, so you can look at how these religious institutions, right, are providing benefits to community members. Strong institutions provide benefits. William Julius Wilson's book, work called The Declining Significant Race, and then following up The Truly Disadvantaged, explains how in Chicago, when the factories were closed down, it created what you might call the underclass, which has been identified as people who found themselves most disadvantaged among the disadvantaged, living in very isolated communities with very few institutions that can provide them with benefits, with very few people who have educational benefits and economic benefits, governmental benefits. And that means that people who live in those areas have a much harder time getting access to the information they need to help them to be able to thrive and even survive.
Yeah. It's such a lot. It is such a lot. Andrea, I've just taken a... But please.
No worries. So you had mentioned something earlier that kind of triggered the thought of gentrification. So you said, so with gentrification, I think we see it a lot in this area, and it's interesting to see that what other people would consider an area that's not so great, but you see people wanting to build more in this area, but then it's not to build and help people who may look like me or you, but it's to bring in other people or of higher class, and that kind of ends up affecting the area as well. And so it's like, it's interesting so I'm thinking about that, and I want to see like what are your thoughts about that, and how maybe we can combat the fact that these organizations are coming in, but they're not coming in and trying to benefit us, but trying to change the surroundings that we are in.
Yeah. So Washington, D.C. is ground zero for gentrification, right? And so we can see how many of the areas have been transformed as a result of a transition of who live there and the investment of resources to improve the quality of the area, right? So it's never just like, oh, let's let these people move in. There's both the let's provide services, let's provide kind of infrastructure, let's provide the resources that these people will need, and then we can have an outcome that we feel good about. And that sense of disruption is always tragic and always difficult and hard for the residents who find themselves without other options. People who live on fixed incomes, for example, and then the taxes go up because neighbors move in who pay more for their property. And then the state is like, or the city is like, okay, well, we should actually charge higher rates because now your property is worth more You're on a fixed income, you paid off your house 20 years ago, but you can't pay the new taxes on the house. That means that you find yourself unable to stay in that residence. Somebody else moves in and says, oh, I can pay the taxes and a mortgage, right? So they buy your house, and then you have to find someplace else to live. Well, in a city like DC, finding another place to live is going to be very difficult. So you'll have to leave to go live in a whole nother city because you can no longer afford to live in that city. And so that gentrification process has two components to it. There's a racial component and there's an economic component. Gentrification is not always racial. Sometimes gentrification is just economic. Taking one group of Latinos and who are wealthy and moving them into an area with another group of Latinos who were working class, right? Same thing is true African Americans. We've seen that happen in Chicago, and other studies have shown how one group moves in and another group moves out of the same racial identity. But then you have the more common, and what we've seen in DC, this gentrification that is both racial and class-based, where whites with money move in and people of color that are middle income or on fixed income, particularly older people, are very subject to the threat, and then they find themselves displaced. So I think it's a problem. I think it requires the public elected officials to put policies in place, which is not that hard. For example, you can grandfather clause rent. You can say, if you've lived in this place for X number of years, or if you live over you're over a certain age, your rent will not go up on your property. I mean, your taxes, grandfather clause taxes, your taxes will not go up on your property. That allows people with fixed incomes to continue to remain in their homes, continue to pay what they've been paying, and experience some of the benefits that come with new investments from the city in infrastructure in certain communities. So it's absolutely a problem that can be addressed when elected officials are committed to addressing it. And that's the issue, right?
Yeah. Do you think it's, to that point, do you think it's more of just not being aware of the issue, or like, we don't care?
Well, there's two pieces to that. One is that the people who are able to pay the highest rates of taxes are those who are able to provide benefits to the city. And I'm just going to put it in a very financial, no racial, no class analysis. If I'm a mayor and my tax base is here, and I can be a mayor of the exact same city, right, with the exact same requirement for city services, and my tax base will be here. If I was given a choice, I'd probably want to have the higher tax base because I have more resources, right, to do good things, to build schools, and to have roads constructed, and to repair sewer lines, and to pay teachers more, and to pay police officers and firefighters more, right? So you can have a desire to have more resources to provide more services, but it takes money. So there is an incentive for elected officials to want to have people who can pay higher taxes in order to provide more services. Yeah. And so, one of the places I've seen this addressed on the West Coast is through putting certain very rigid requirements in place about affordable housing, to say that you have to keep a certain percentage of affordable housing. The argument typically is that those percentages are too low. And so if you keep a certain percentage of affordable housing and those percentages are high enough, then you help to decrease the level of displacement that happens when you have new people move into a community, which is something that elected officials often want to see happen, because there may be new opportunities that are also being created.
Yeah, I think you've highlighted just how complex, how very, very complex the issue is. But that should not dissuade us from wanting to make change and to demand as citizens that we start chipping away and making real change, Yeah. Andrea, did you have a question, or are there some from our audience?
I don't know if there is any from the audience, but one question I do have that I feel that is important is, what are like the generational effects that, whether that may be mental, emotionally, or physical, that we see from redlining issues from before, or just from even now that we see?
Yeah, unfortunately, let's go to the easy one, is educational. So what we can find is that schools in these areas that were redlined at that time had limited resources, and that there was significant racial discrimination in who can attend them. And today, even though the attendance is not racially mandated, the consequence is that these schools still tend to have limited resources, and they tend to be highly racially segregated. Not segregated in the sense of the law requires it, but segregated in the sense of they are still largely, only represented by one racial group. So what the consequences are is that means that people's experience and the resources they have exposure to, the number of AP classes, the number of honors classes, the number of accelerated classes, the teachers, the subject curriculum, these resources are not the same that are being made available to people who live in communities that were green-lined. Those that had those green color codes as being desirable for investment are those that are also communities that continue to thrive. And so in some cases, gentrification, we can think of Georgetown. Gentrification produces, right, in Georgetown, what it looks like today versus what it looked like when African Americans had a much more significant presence there. And ultimately, gentrification tended to move some of them out, and some just chose to move. And so when you look at the resources available in Georgetown, the institutions that are available in Georgetown, you can see how people who live in Southeast, in contrast, might find themselves very differently positioned to take advantage of opportunities in American society if they grew up in Georgetown versus if they grew up in certain parts of Southeast. And so those impacts are 5 generations later, people are still experiencing this disparity, right? So it's compounded in some sense that it never has gone away. And those limitations continue to have an effect even into the present.
Yeah. We're almost out of time, but I don't want to end on that note. Give us some hope, Professor Waterhouse.
I think there's a lot of reason for hope,
Okay.
right? And so in many ways, what we experience today versus what people experienced in the 1930s during redlining is so much more opportunities,
Okay.
so many more choices.
Okay, I'm snapping.
Right?
Okay.
The fight for civil rights was not a failure. It was a success, just not a complete success. The fight continues. But our opportunities for education, our opportunities for employment, the elimination of formal racial discrimination provides opportunities. Now, in light of that, we have to be willing to work together creatively to take advantage of some of those opportunities. And we do see the glass ceiling is constantly being broken. African American wealth is continually being created. We can still see places where African Americans in the federal government continue to find higher and higher heights of attainment. In economic spheres, we have these new billionaires, African American tech folks, African American entertainers who are creating opportunities. So it's not all a bad game. It's just a matter of recognizing that there are still challenges that we need to not ignore. But at the same time, we talk about PG County, Mitchellville, St. Charles. There are a lot of people who have a great deal of wealth and riches that we see amassed in those counties alone in places,
Definitely.
which is much greater than we would have found in the 1930s.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Well, we could talk for another couple of hours and just sort of sit at your feet and learn and absorb and have it present it in such a way that we can all understand. So we really, really appreciate you, Dr. Waterhouse, for coming and spending this time with us, for just really being, as one of our viewers said, very thought-provoking discussion, because we all actually have we all have a hand in this. Like, we all can demand change and demand accountability, right? So thank you.
One quick note,
Mm-hmm.
we should recognize that this was not exclusively an African-American experience. Those yellow areas, they had whites, they had immigrants, they had people from other places who also suffered the consequences just because they lived next to the place that was all African-American. And so they also had financial impacts upon them and their opportunities and the institutions that were available. So working together across groups is the best way for us to find success rather than feeling like we're all alone and we can only do it ourselves. Has to be a sense of finding partners and allies and working collaboratively to create a better future.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And the history shows us that that's exactly how we make change, by working together. So thank you for reminding us of that. Well, we thank everyone that spent this hour with us, learning and thinking. And we hope that you're not just listening. We hope that you take something concrete to then do something, right? We don't want to be fence sitters and to, right? We want to do something with this knowledge that Dr. Waterhouse has given us, right? So he's given us lots of great resources and things to read. And I'm going to look for your dissertation, The Full Price of Freedom. I may be calling you to say, explain this, but we really appreciate. And for everyone that is with us tonight, we want to just tell you a couple of things that are, well, more than just a couple, but bear with me. Tomorrow night, Andrea Lopez Herrera, who also put this program together, put together another program that you don't want to miss tomorrow night, same at 7 o'clock on same StreamYard and YouTube. And it is part of her Empowering the Game series. And she's going to be in conversation with U.S. gymnast and Prince Georgian Koi Young. So please join us for that. I want to remind everybody of a new series that we started last Thursday, and it'll be every Thursday through the beginning of May, where we are engaging the community in social justice through the University of Maryland Department of Sociology, and some of the PhD students who are going to come and talk in practical terms about their projects, their dissertations. We had a wonderful conversation last Thursday, so please come back Thursday, 2 o'clock, same StreamYard. Please join us next Tuesday, the 13th. We're going to be in conversation with the author of Path to Grace, Reimagining the Civil Rights Movement. That's Ethel Morgan Smith, a wonderful book. Please join us. If you're out and about, you will remember that we started the Rock Band series where we are all collectively reading 13 of the most banned books according to the American Library Association. And so Wednesday the 14th at 6:30, we're going to be at Spalding Library reading Toni Morrison, The Bluest Eyes. We'll learn why that was banned. And two other things we want to highlight. One, please join us on the 15th, next Thursday at 7 p.m., where we're going to talk about a story, musical connections. You've heard from Alex Strawn, who is a police officer here in the county. He happens to be African-American. He happens to also be a fabulous violinist, and he uses his violin as a way to connect with the community. And there's an amazing story that came about as a result of some of that exposure with a donation of a violin. So please join us to hear that story. And last but not least, well, we have two other things. Join us, February 21st at 6:30. We're going to do a live Instagram where you can learn a little bit more about the Office of Human Rights and all of the amazing things that we are tasked with. We are a small agency with a mighty mission. So come learn more. And last but not least, this is an in-person event on February 22nd at 7 a.m. at the Hyattsville Mennonite Church. We are going to talk about finding light in the darkness with panelist Rahma Abdul-Alim, Pastor Cindy Lapp, Rabbi Abby Sharofsky, and both Rabbi Abby and Rahma have been frequent guests in our other series, Women in Faith, Diverse Voices Speak series. So please join us to learn about how we find light in the darkness. So thank you everyone for joining us. You can find all of our upcoming events and all of our past events where you can watch on our web page. You can just Google Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, or I'm sure Kyla will put on the bottom. There we go, because I cannot remember.
And just to clarify, the February 22nd event will be at 7 p.m. At the Hyattsville Mennonite Church, Just
Thank you. I probably said something crazy. Yeah.
It's okay.
Okay. Thank you. I thought I was saying that, so thank you.
No problem.
No, thank you. So thank you again, Dr. Waterhouse, Andrea,
Yes,
Kyla, who's been operating backstage on tech, and thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you tomorrow night. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Have a great evening. Bye-bye.